Picture this. You're watching a debate unfold online. Two people are discussing something important: education reform, economic policy, something that matters. Within minutes, the conversation derails. Personal attacks replace arguments. Someone digs up an old tweet. The comment section explodes with mockery and memes. Nobody remembers what the original topic was. Socrates saw this coming over 2,000 years ago. When the debate is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser. He understood that when truth becomes too difficult to defend, people replace it with noise, substance with spectacle, wisdom with whatever gets the most attention. Here we are today, living in a world where visibility is confused with intelligence. The loudest voices are assumed to be the smartest. The person who crafts the most devastating comeback is celebrated more than the person who presents the most thoughtful argument. We've built entire platforms around this principle: reward the quick, the savage, the entertaining, punish the thoughtful, the nuanced, the careful. Let's clarify something important. When we talk about idiots here, we're not talking about intelligence or IQ, we're talking about a specific behavioral pattern. The performatively confident person who mistakes certainty for understanding, who confuses speaking loudly with speaking wisely, who values winning arguments over discovering truth. This isn't about mocking people who lack education. It's about examining how our culture increasingly rewards intellectual laziness dressed up as bold authenticity. This is about something Socrates warned would destroy civilizations: the elevation of performance over principle, the worship of certainty over curiosity. When a culture stops valuing truth and starts valuing only what captures attention, it begins a slow collapse inward. So, how do you know if you're living in such a society? Let's explore 6 signs that Socrates himself would recognize, 6 symptoms of a shift in how we determine who deserves to be heard. There's a particular phenomenon unfolding across modern discourse. It often feels like our society rewards a specific type of person, someone who speaks with absolute certainty about everything. They have an opinion on every topic, delivered with the confidence of someone who has spent decades researching the subject. Except they haven't. They've spent maybe 20 minutes scrolling through headlines, but that doesn't stop them from dominating every conversation they enter. Plato, Socrates' most famous student, captured this perfectly. Fools talk because they have to say something. The wise speak because they have something to say. That distinction has never been more relevant. Think about the last time you watched someone become influential online or in media. What qualified them for their platform? In many cases, it wasn't careful research or thoughtful analysis. It was mastering the art of never admitting uncertainty, never acknowledging complexity, never saying, "I don't know." This is the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with limited knowledge in a domain dramatically overestimate their own competence. The person who has read one article about climate science feels qualified to dismiss decades of research. The person who watched a documentary about nutrition suddenly believes they understand human metabolism better than trained dietitians. Here's the psychological mechanism at work. When you know very little about something, you don't know enough to recognize what you don't know. You can't see the gaps in your understanding because you haven't learned enough to know those gaps exist. It's only when you gain genuine expertise that you start to see how complex the subject really is, how many variables are at play, how much you still have to learn. But our current information ecosystem seems to actively reward the Dunning-Kruger sweet spot: just enough knowledge to sound authoritative, not enough to recognize your own limitations. Algorithms don't naturally promote careful, measured analysis, they promote engagement. And what generates engagement? Certainty, controversy, conflict. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth we need to address. There are legitimate reasons why people have become skeptical of expertise. Institutions have failed people. The 2008 financial crisis happened because people with impressive credentials made catastrophic decisions. Public health messaging during various crises has sometimes been inconsistent. Scientific findings get overhyped by media, then fail to replicate. When people say they don't trust experts anymore, they're not always being irrational. Sometimes they're responding to real experiences of being misled. The problem isn't skepticism itself. Socrates would have applauded healthy skepticism. The problem is when we respond to the failure of some experts by concluding that expertise itself is worthless. When we throw out the entire concept of specialized knowledge in favor of just asking questions that lead nowhere. The tragedy is that this creates a false choice, either blind faith in credentialed authority or complete dismissal of specialized knowledge. But there's a middle path, one where we can remain appropriately skeptical while still recognizing that spending years studying something usually does provide insight that casual observation doesn't. What we're witnessing isn't just a loss of trust, it's an inversion of credibility at the individual psychological level. The less someone knows, the more confident they feel. And in a system that rewards confidence, this becomes a competitive advantage. Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. For him, knowledge wasn't something you collected like trading cards. It was something that transformed you. Real wisdom changed how you saw the world, how you treated others, how you understood yourself. It required discipline, reflection, and the willingness to have your beliefs challenged. Now compare that to how we often consume information today. We scroll through endless feeds of content labeled as educational or insightful. We watch 3-minute videos explaining complex philosophical concepts. We save articles we never read. We screenshot profound quotes and share them without contemplating what they actually mean. It often feels like we've turned knowledge into a dopamine delivery system. The goal isn't transformation, it's the brief feeling of having learned something. It's the small hit of satisfaction that comes from consuming content that makes us feel smarter without actually requiring us to do the hard work of becoming wiser. Think about the explosion of productivity tips and life hack content. Millions of people consume this material daily. They learn about time management systems, morning routines, meditation practices, networking strategies. They absorb this information enthusiastically. Yet, how many actually implement what they learn? How many find their lives genuinely transformed? The consumption itself seems to have become the goal. We collect information like trophies, displaying our awareness of various concepts without ever letting those concepts actually reshape our thinking. We sometimes confuse the accumulation of facts with the cultivation of wisdom. This is what Socrates feared. He understood that true knowledge requires discomfort. It requires you to confront your own ignorance, to question beliefs you've held for years, to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing to easy answers. That process isn't entertaining. It doesn't fit into snackable content. It can't be gamified or optimized. But when knowledge becomes primarily entertainment, something shifts. We begin to mistake information for understanding. People can recite facts without comprehending their implications. Everyone has opinions about everything, but perhaps wisdom about very little. The appearance of knowledge becomes more valuable than knowledge itself. Here's something Socrates couldn't have predicted because the technology didn't exist in his time. What happens when there's a financial incentive to make people angry? We're living in an attention economy. Media companies, social platforms, content creators, they all compete for the same scarce resource, your time and engagement. And they've discovered something profound about human psychology. Nothing captures attention quite like outrage. Watch how information spreads today. A story appears, often incomplete, sometimes misleading, occasionally completely fabricated, but it triggers strong emotions. Anger, fear, righteous indignation, and that emotional charge causes it to spread faster than any careful analysis ever could. By the time fact-checkers examine the claim, millions have already absorbed it as truth. By the time nuance is added, the narrative has already solidified. This isn't just a bug in the system, it's the intended feature. Platforms optimize for engagement, and outrage engages. News outlets compete for clicks, and anger generates clicks. Content creators fight for views, and controversy gets views. The entire economic structure of modern media rewards content that makes people feel something intense, preferably something that divides them into camps and keeps them arguing. Socrates taught his students to think for yourself. But independent thought requires something difficult: the ability to step back from your immediate emotional response and ask whether what you're feeling is justified by the facts. It requires questioning whether the source providing the information might have reasons to manipulate your emotions. It requires the discipline to seek out perspectives that challenge your initial reaction. Our current information environment makes that incredibly difficult. Not impossible, but the system is working against you. Every algorithm, every business model, every incentive structure is designed to keep you emotionally engaged, not rationally informed. Now, let's be clear. Emotions aren't the enemy. Emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize emotion in ourselves and others and still choose a reasoned path, is actually crucial. The problem isn't having feelings about injustice or caring deeply about issues. The problem is when those feelings are deliberately manipulated to bypass our critical thinking entirely, when we're kept in a constant state of reactivity that prevents reflection. This creates a kind of emotional tribalism. People align themselves with whatever makes them feel like they're on the right side of history, like they're fighting the good fight, like they're part of something meaningful. The actual truth of the matter sometimes becomes almost irrelevant compared to the emotional satisfaction of belonging to a movement. Movements built on emotion can be powerful. They can mobilize people quickly. They can create intense feelings of solidarity and purpose, but they also burn out fast. When the emotional intensity fades, and it always does, people move on to the next outrage, the next cause, the next thing that makes them feel something strong. Meanwhile, the underlying issues remain unaddressed because we were too busy feeling to actually think. Can you recognize when your emotions are being manipulated? Can you feel strongly about something while still asking whether your strong feelings are justified? That's the challenge of living in an economy that profits from keeping you outraged. There's a particular kind of silence spreading through institutions, workplaces, and communities. It's not the silence of having nothing to say. It's the silence of knowing that speaking honestly carries too high a cost. Imagine a teacher who sees students adopting beliefs that are demonstrably false. The teacher knows these beliefs will harm the students' understanding of the world, limit their critical thinking abilities, and potentially damage their futures. But speaking up would mean accusations of bias, it would mean complaints to administrators, it might even cost their job. So the teacher stays quiet, goes along, and watches their students embrace nonsense because honesty has become too dangerous. This pattern appears everywhere. In universities where professors sometimes self-censor to avoid student complaints. In companies where employees remain silent about obvious problems because raising concerns is seen as not being a team player. In communities where people watch destructive patterns unfold but say nothing because anyone who objects gets ostracized. Socrates said, "The only good is knowledge and the only evil is ignorance." But what happens when sharing knowledge becomes a form of social suicide? What happens when speaking truth risks punishment, while spreading comfortable lies guarantees acceptance? Now, we need to acknowledge something important here. The call to listen to the wise has historically been used to silence marginalized voices. Established experts have often been the ones defending unjust systems, slavery, segregation, the exclusion of women from public life. Sometimes the silencing of certain voices was necessary for progress. And the same platforms that elevate fools also give voice to people who were previously excluded by gatekeepers of expertise. The The question isn't whether all established voices deserve platforms or whether all challenges to authority are valid. The question is, can we distinguish between valuable challenges to power and mere performance? Between necessary disruption and destructive noise? What's concerning isn't that people are being challenged, it's the mechanism of that challenge. It's when thoughtful disagreement becomes impossible because the social cost of nuanced positions is too high. When people stay silent, not because their ideas are harmful, but because any complexity will be weaponized against them. This creates a phenomenon psychologists call pluralistic ignorance. It occurs when everyone privately disagrees with a prevailing belief or behavior, but each person assumes they're alone in their disagreement, so everyone stays silent. Everyone goes along. Everyone pretends to agree. And the false consensus becomes real through sheer lack of opposition. The tragedy is that the people who stay silent aren't cowards. They're often the most thoughtful, the most careful, the most genuinely knowledgeable. They understand nuance. They see complexity. And they know that nuance and complexity don't survive in an environment that demands absolute certainty and punishes any deviation from accepted narratives. When thoughtful voices, regardless of their position, go silent out of fear, society loses its ability to have productive disagreement. The loudest, most certain, least reflective voices face no opposition. They dominate discourse simply because everyone with something meaningful to say has been intimidated into silence. Have you ever stayed silent when you knew you should speak? Not because your idea was harmful, but because expressing it carefully and honestly seemed too risky? You're not alone. And that's exactly the problem. Think about who gets celebrated in contemporary culture. Who gets held up as someone to admire and emulate? Is it people of genuine virtue, those who demonstrate wisdom, integrity, compassion, and moral courage? Or is it often people who have accumulated power, wealth, and influence regardless of how they obtained it? Socrates argued that we should prefer knowledge to wealth, for the one is transitory, the other perpetual. He believed that virtue, genuine goodness of character, was the only thing truly worth pursuing, that a good life was one lived according to wisdom and moral principles, not one measured by material success or social status. But it often feels like we've created a culture that celebrates results while remaining largely indifferent to methods. A business leader who built their fortune through exploitation of workers and destruction of competitors might still be lauded as a visionary entrepreneur. A politician who lies constantly, manipulates relentlessly, but wins elections gets praised as a master strategist. An influencer who deceives their audience, promotes harmful products but gains millions of followers is held up as someone who made it. Consider a specific example. When a tech billionaire is exposed for union busting, creating unsafe working conditions, or using monopolistic practices, do we collectively reject them? Or do we rationalize it? Well, that's just business. You have to be ruthless to succeed at that level. They're playing the game better than everyone else. We seem to have separated success from virtue so completely that suggesting the two should be connected sometimes seems almost naive. Of course, people cut corners. Of course, they manipulate and deceive. Of course, they prioritize personal gain over ethical behavior. That's just how the world works. That's being realistic. This separation is fueled by the same attention economy that rewards outrage. The path of virtue is often quiet and slow. It doesn't generate headlines or viral moments. The person who builds something meaningful over decades through honest work doesn't get the documentary. But the person who rises fast through questionable means, then falls spectacularly, that's content. That's engagement. That generates clicks, shares, and commentary. Every scandal, every revelation of corruption, every uncover of unethical behavior becomes content that platforms can monetize. We've built systems that profit more from documenting moral failures than from celebrating moral exemplars. And what gets monetized gets amplified. What gets amplified shapes what we value. This creates a phenomenon psychologists call moral licensing. the tendency to excuse unethical behavior in people we perceive as successful. We tell ourselves that their achievements justify their methods, that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, that they're playing the game better than everyone else, and we should admire their cunning rather than condemn their corruption. But here's what this does to a society. It makes corruption aspirational. It teaches young people that integrity is for losers, that doing the right thing is less important than getting ahead, that wisdom and virtue are nice in theory but impractical in reality. Meanwhile, the person who chose integrity over shortcuts, who built slowly and ethically, who helped others along the way, they're forgotten. They don't get the platform, the profile, the celebration, not because their achievements aren't impressive, but because virtue doesn't generate the kind of engagement that our systems reward. When a culture begins celebrating winning at any cost, it creates a race to the bottom. Why be honest when dishonesty succeeds? Why be thoughtful when impulsiveness gets results? Why cultivate wisdom when ignorance combined with confidence proves more profitable? Here's a question. When was the last time you heard someone say, "It's complicated," and have that statement be received as wisdom rather than evasion? We're living through an era of false binaries. Every issue gets reduced to two opposing sides. Every question has exactly one correct answer. Every problem has a simple solution that only idiots or villains would oppose. The very concept of complexity has become suspect. If something is complicated, it's probably because someone is trying to confuse you. Plato wrote that ignorance is the root and stem of every evil. But perhaps the more precise modern version would be, the refusal to acknowledge complexity is the root of much contemporary harm. Reality is nuanced. Most important issues involve trade-offs where there is no perfect solution, only choices between imperfect alternatives. Climate policy involves balancing environmental concerns with economic realities and human welfare. Criminal justice reform requires weighing public safety against rehabilitation and individual rights. Healthcare systems must navigate quality, accessibility, and cost constraints. These aren't simple problems with obvious answers. They're complex systems where every intervention has ripple effects. But nuance doesn't translate well into viral content. It doesn't fit on a protest sign. It can't be captured in a tweet or a soundbite. So we strip away the complexity. We turn every issue into a battle between good and evil, smart and stupid, us and them. And in doing so, we make solving actual problems nearly impossible. The disappearance of nuance creates several predictable outcomes. First, it makes compromise seem like betrayal. If there's only one right answer, anyone who suggests a middle path must be either stupid or corrupt. Second, it makes people defensive. When every issue is framed as all or nothing, admitting any flaw in your position feels like total defeat. Third, it makes learning impossible. If acknowledging complexity is seen as weakness, no one can update their views based on new information without appearing to have been completely wrong before. Socrates spent his life asking questions, exploring complexities, acknowledging what he didn't know. He understood that wisdom begins with recognizing how much you don't understand. But we've created an environment where admitting uncertainty or acknowledging trade-offs is seen as disqualifying, where the person who says, "I need to think about this more," is dismissed, while the person who claims to have all the answers is celebrated. What happens to a society that loses the ability to think in shades of gray, that can only process information in terms of absolute right and absolute wrong? It becomes a society unable to solve complex problems because complex problems don't have simple solutions. It becomes a society perpetually at war with itself because every disagreement becomes existential. It becomes a society where thoughtfulness is a liability and certainty, no matter how unwarranted, is an asset. Socrates offered one final piece of wisdom. The easiest and noblest way is not to be crushing others, but to be improving yourselves. He understood that healthy societies are built by people committed to their own growth, their own wisdom, their own virtue. Every sign we've examined points to the same underlying condition, a culture that has drifted away from valuing truth, wisdom, and genuine excellence. The inversion of credibility, the reduction of knowledge to entertainment, the economy of outrage, the silencing of thoughtful voices through fear, the celebration of success divorced from virtue, the disappearance of nuance. Socrates predicted this pattern. He warned that when societies stop making truth sacred, other things rush in to fill the void. History proves him right. Look at societies that silenced their philosophers and elevated their jesters. They all followed similar patterns, choosing what was loud, simple, and emotionally satisfying over what was true. But here's what gives me hope. You're watching this video. You're thinking about these ideas. You're questioning the patterns you see around you. That's exactly what Socrates would have encouraged. So what can you actually do? Let me offer some specific practices. Practice intellectual humility, say, "I don't know," and "I was wrong" out loud. Not as weakness, but as strength. Engage charitably. Before you attack a position, make sure you truly understand it. Could you explain this view in a way that its strongest advocate would recognize? Curate your information diet. Actively follow experts and thinkers who challenge you. If all your sources make you feel validated, you're not learning. You're being reinforced. Reward substance. When you see someone acknowledge complexity, appreciate their honesty instead of punishing them for not having a simple answer. Send a signal that thoughtfulness has value. Embrace uncertainty. Not every issue needs to be resolved immediately. Sometimes the wisest response is, "I'm still thinking about this." Societies change through the accumulated choices of individuals who decide to live differently, through people who value truth over comfort, through those who choose wisdom over noise. When a society stops thinking, it doesn't fall to its enemies, it falls to its own worst tendencies, the ones it elevated, celebrated, and rewarded. Socrates saw this pattern. He spent his life trying to wake Athens from its intellectual slumber. They killed him for it. But his ideas survived because some people recognized their value, even when following them came at a cost. These aren't grand gestures. They won't make you go viral or get you celebrated. But they are forms of resistance against a system designed to make you reactive, tribal, and certain. The question isn't whether you can single-handedly reverse cultural trends. You can't. The question is whether you're willing to be one person who refuses to participate in the worship of certainty over wisdom. One person who asks genuine questions. One person who admits when they don't know something. One person who rewards thoughtfulness. Because that's how change actually happens. Not through grand declarations, but through individual choices, repeated consistently, that slowly shift what gets valued and rewarded. Socrates saw this pattern 25 centuries ago. The question he would ask you today is simple. What are you going to do about it?